In the summer of 1976, the world awoke to a story that did not sound like science. It sounded like a warning. Newspapers across the United States and beyond reported the discovery of a strange creature, one that left scientists unsettled and the public deeply confused. It was described as an animal, yet it moved like a human, a chimpanzee, yet somehow not entirely a chimpanzee. Witnesses struggled to describe what they were seeing because the creature appeared to stand on the narrow, fragile line between human and animal. His name was Oliver. At first glance, Oliver looked like a chimpanzee, but the longer people stared, the more uncomfortable they became. His face was unusually flat, lacking the prominent muzzle that defines his species. His nose was smaller and less pronounced. His ears were shorter, sharper, and set closer to his head. His eyes, light-colored and expressive, seemed to hold a kind of awareness that observers struggled to explain. But what truly disturbed those who saw Oliver was not how he looked, it was how he walked. Unlike every chimpanzee documented by science, Oliver preferred to move upright, balancing on two legs with ease and confidence. He did not hunch forward. He did not knuckle walk. He stood tall, his spine straight, his posture eerily human. And most unsettling of all, this behavior was not trained. Oliver was not taught to walk this way. He preferred it. Scientists who witnessed Oliver walking described a feeling they could not easily articulate, a sense that something fundamental was out of place, as if evolution itself had produced an exception it was never meant to create. Some observers compared the experience to watching a character escape from a science fiction film. Others admitted they felt fear, not of Oliver, but of what his existence might imply. Because if Oliver truly represented something new, then the story of human evolution was not as complete as science had claimed. The media quickly seized on the mystery. Headlines exploded with speculation. Journalists searched for the most provocative labels they could find. Soon, Oliver was no longer just a chimpanzee. He was being called the missing link. Others went even further. They gave him a name that blended fear, fascination, and taboo into a single word: the Humanzee. A term that combined human and chimpanzee, suggesting a hybrid, an idea that science had long rejected, yet could never fully erase from the public imagination. The story spread rapidly. Television shows requested appearances. Magazines demanded photographs. Scientists debated behind closed doors. For researchers, this was not a curiosity. It was a potential nightmare. Because if Oliver was what some believed he might be, then decades of evolutionary theory would need to be re-examined. The carefully constructed boundaries between species, boundaries humanity relied on to define itself, would suddenly become unstable. But Oliver did not appear from a laboratory. He did not emerge from an experiment. His story began far from cameras, far from scientists, and far from civilization. Deep within the dense rainforests of Central Africa, it is widely believed that Oliver was born somewhere in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, although no records exist to confirm this. His early life in the wild remains a mystery, one that will never be fully uncovered. What is known is that in 1957, while still an infant, Oliver was captured. He was taken from the forest before he could learn the social rules of his species, before he could bond with other chimpanzees, before nature could shape him fully. By 1960, when Oliver was approximately 2 years old, he had already crossed the ocean. He was purchased by Frank and Janet Berger, a married couple from the United States who worked as professional animal trainers. The Bergers were well known in the entertainment industry, having appeared multiple times on the Ed Sullivan Show, one of the most influential television programs of the 20th century. To the Bergers, Oliver was initially just another animal, but that illusion did not last long. Almost immediately, they noticed something strange. Oliver stood up, not occasionally, not as a trick, but naturally. He moved through rooms on two legs. He balanced without effort. He watched humans closely, studying their behavior with unusual focus. And unlike other chimpanzees, Oliver showed little interest in his own kind. He preferred human company. He observed facial expressions. He reacted to tone of voice. His own expressions seemed intentional, almost thoughtful. The burgers tried to understand what they were witnessing. They examined his posture. They tested his behavior. They compared him to other chimpanzees they had trained. Nothing matched. Oliver was not being taught to act human. He already was. The couple began to speculate, perhaps irresponsibly, perhaps inevitably. What if Oliver was more than a chimpanzee? What if he represented a genetic anomaly, a mutation, or something science had never encountered before? They were not scientists. They had no access to laboratories or genetic testing, but speculation filled the void where certainty should have been. Yet, despite their growing fascination, the Burges' motivations were not scientific. They were commercial. The 1960s were the golden age of performing animals. Chimpanzees were especially popular. They were dressed in human clothes, trained to ride bicycles, mimic gestures, and perform comedic routines. They appeared in circuses, advertisements, and television shows, captivating audiences who saw reflections of themselves in these animals. Chimpanzees were profitable. And Oliver, with his upright walk and human-like demeanor, was exceptional. He was introduced to audiences as something special, not just a performing animal, but a phenomenon, a creature that blurred boundaries and challenged expectations. Audiences were fascinated. But Oliver's fame remained limited. His appearances were sporadic, his exposure was modest. And as he grew older, new problems emerged. Oliver became stronger, more unpredictable, more difficult to manage. Keeping him in a human household became dangerous. His size, strength, and emotional complexity made daily life increasingly stressful for the Burges. By the mid-1970s, the decision was made. Oliver had to be sold. In 1975, he was purchased by a Manhattan attorney named Michael Miller for $8,000, a massive sum at the time. To the Burgers, the transaction represented closure. They believed they were freeing themselves from a growing burden while securing a financial reward. They did not realize that this sale marked the true beginning of Oliver's transformation from obscure curiosity to global mystery. Because Michael Miller saw something the Burges did not. He saw potential. He understood that Oliver was not just an animal. He was a story capable of capturing headlines, igniting controversy, and drawing the attention of the scientific world. And in the spring of 1976, Michael Miller would place Oliver in front of the one audience guaranteed to change everything: scientists.
By the time Oliver arrived in New York, he was no longer just an unusual chimpanzee. He was a question that science had avoided for decades. Michael Miller understood something instinctively. In a city fueled by attention, controversy, and spectacle, Oliver was more than an animal. He was a living paradox, and paradoxes attract headlines. Within weeks of Oliver's arrival, word began to spread through academic circles. Primatologists, anthropologists, and zoologists heard rumors of a chimpanzee that walked upright, lacked typical chimp features, and behaved in ways that defied established research. At first, most scientists were skeptical. Extraordinary claims demanded extraordinary evidence, but curiosity is difficult to suppress. Soon, Oliver was brought to be examined by researchers from various institutions. Some came cautiously, expecting exaggeration. Others arrived prepared to debunk the story entirely. None of them left unchanged. The first thing scientists noticed was Oliver's anatomy. His skull did not match known chimpanzee measurements precisely. The cranium appeared slightly larger. The facial structure was flatter. The jaw was less pronounced. His teeth, while still chimpanzee-like, seemed unusually arranged. Measurements were taken again and again. Each time, the data refused to fit neatly into existing categories. Then there was his posture. Chimpanzees can stand upright briefly, but doing so requires effort. Their skeletal structure is designed primarily for knuckle walking and climbing. Prolonged bipedal movement causes strain, not for Oliver. Oliver stood comfortably. He walked for extended periods on two legs without fatigue. His gait was smoother than expected. His balance was stable. His spine appeared to support upright posture more naturally than any chimpanzee previously documented. Scientists watched in silence as Oliver crossed rooms without using his arms. No tricks, no training, just preference. This alone caused unease, but the behavioral observations were even more troubling. Oliver showed little interest in typical chimpanzee social behaviors. He did not groom other chimps. He did not respond strongly to dominance displays. He avoided aggressive interaction. Instead, Oliver gravitated towards humans. He made eye contact. He observed. He reacted to conversation tone, facial expression, and emotional shifts with a sensitivity researchers struggled to explain. Some scientists reported feeling uncomfortable under his gaze, not because he was threatening, but because he seemed to be watching with intention. As word spread, media attention followed. Newspapers published photographs. Talk shows requested interviews. Journalists exaggerated details, pushing the narrative towards sensationalism. The term Humanzee resurfaced with force, a hybrid, half-human, half-chimpanzee, a forbidden crossing of nature's boundaries. The scientific community reacted swiftly and defensively. Official statements were released, rejecting the idea of a human-chimpanzee hybrid. Genetic theory, reproductive barriers, and evolutionary divergence made such a hybrid biologically implausible. But privately, debates were far less certain, because while Oliver might not be a hybrid, he was undeniably different, and science did not yet have a name for what he was. Some researchers proposed that Oliver was simply a genetic outlier, a rare mutation that produced unusual traits without implying a new species. Others suggested early developmental trauma, perhaps being removed from the wild as an infant, disrupted his social learning, causing him to mimic humans instead of other chimpanzees. But this explanation failed to account for his skeletal differences. Environment could influence behavior. It could not reshape bone structure so profoundly. A smaller group of scientists entertained a more radical idea. What if Oliver represented a previously undocumented subspecies, a branch of chimpanzees with unique evolutionary traits? This suggestion was quickly dismissed in public forums. Accepting it would require acknowledging that major primate populations had gone undocumented, a deeply uncomfortable possibility for a field that prided itself on classification and control. The controversy intensified when Oliver was placed in a research facility for extended observation. Here, his differences became impossible to ignore. When housed with other chimpanzees, Oliver remained distant. He did not integrate. He appeared confused by their behaviors and uninterested in their social rituals. In contrast, when caretakers entered the enclosure, Oliver approached. He stood upright. He gestured. He vocalized softly, not in typical chimp calls, but in subdued sounds that researchers could not categorize. Some interpreted these sounds as attempts at speech. Others dismissed that idea entirely. But everyone agreed on one thing. Oliver was isolated.
Not by cages, but by biology. And isolation has consequences. As the years passed, Oliver's public appeal faded. New scientific discoveries captured attention, funding shifted, media outlets moved on. But Oliver remained, trapped between worlds, too human to live comfortably among chimpanzees, too chimpanzee to belong among humans. In 1977, Oliver's circumstances took a darker turn. He was transferred to a private research farm in Texas, a facility that housed exotic animals for study and breeding. The conditions were far from ideal. Enclosures were small, Social interaction was limited. Stimulation was minimal. For an animal as cognitively complex as Oliver, the environment was devastating. Observers later described his behavior during this period as withdrawn. He paced. He avoided interaction. He exhibited signs of psychological distress. Years passed. The scientific community largely forgot him. But Oliver did not disappear entirely. Rumors persisted. Stories circulated quietly among primatologists. Whispers of a chimpanzee who walked like a man and stared like a thinker. Then, in the 1990s, technology finally caught up with the mystery. Genetic testing had advanced. DNA analysis was now precise enough to answer questions that had haunted Oliver's story for decades. In 1996, researchers conducted a full genetic analysis. The results were definitive. Oliver was 100% chimpanzee. No human DNA, no hybridization, no evolutionary anomaly that redefined species boundaries. The announcement was meant to close the case, to put the legend to rest. But instead, it raised new questions. Because if Oliver was genetically a chimpanzee, why was he so different? The answer forced scientists to confront an uncomfortable truth. Genetics explains what an organism is. It does not always explain who it becomes. Oliver's life was shaped by disruption. Captured as an infant, removed from his species, raised among humans during critical developmental stages, denied the social framework his brain evolved to depend on. His upright walking may have been reinforced by imitation. His human-oriented behavior may have been learned through necessity. But learning does not diminish reality. Oliver was not pretending. He was adapting in a world that never allowed him to belong. When Oliver was eventually transferred to primarily primates, a sanctuary in Texas, something remarkable happened. For the first time in decades, he was given space, choice, freedom from expectation, and slowly, something changed. Oliver began walking on all fours more frequently. He interacted, cautiously, with other chimpanzees. He groaned, he rested. He simply existed. Not as a mystery, not as a spectacle, but as a chimpanzee. Oliver died in 2012 at approximately 55 years old. He did not leave behind a new species. He did not rewrite evolution. But he left something more important. A warning. A lesson. That intelligence is fragile. That identity is shaped by environment as much as DNA. And that when humans blur boundaries for curiosity, profit, or fame, it is not science that pays the price. It is the subject.
Oliver's story should have ended with answers, with data, with closure. But instead, it ended with silence. After genetic testing confirmed that Oliver was a fully chimpanzee, no human DNA, no hybrid origin, the world quietly moved on. Newspapers stopped printing his name. Television shows found new curiosities. The scientific community filed his case under resolved. But for those who had truly observed Oliver, nothing felt resolved at all. Because science had answered what Oliver was, it had not answered why he became who he was. And that question refused to disappear. At the sanctuary in Texas, away from laboratories and cameras, Oliver lived the final years of his life in relative peace. There were no experiments, no expectations, no audience demanding meaning from his existence. For the first time since infancy, Oliver was allowed to simply be. Caretakers at the sanctuary noticed subtle but profound changes. Over time, Oliver's posture softened. He no longer insisted on walking upright. He moved naturally between 2 legs and 4, choosing comfort over habit. This was not regression. It was release. When given the freedom to live without human pressure, Oliver gravitated toward behaviors his species had evolved for. He slept longer. He interacted calmly. He showed curiosity without anxiety. And yet, he never fully became normal. He remained gentle, quiet, observant. Even among other chimpanzees, Oliver carried himself differently. Not superior, not inferior, just altered. A living record of an interrupted life. Primatologists who later reviewed Oliver's case began to shift their perspective. What once seemed like an evolutionary mystery now appeared to be something else entirely: a developmental tragedy. Chimpanzees, like humans, experience critical learning periods early in life. During these stages, social cues, movement patterns, emotional regulation, and identity are shaped permanently. Remove a chimpanzee from its social environment during this window, and the consequences can last a lifetime. Oliver was removed too early. He was raised by humans who did not understand what they were replacing. They taught him to walk upright, not realizing they were reshaping his musculoskeletal habits. They spoke around him, not realizing he would attune himself to human vocal patterns. They dressed him, posed him, and rewarded behaviors that pleased audiences. And Oliver learned, because learning is what intelligent beings do. But learning without choice is not adaptation. It is survival. As research advanced in the decades following Oliver's death, scientists began to understand something deeply unsettling. Oliver was not unique. He was just visible. Across the world, primates raised in captivity displayed abnormal behaviors: rocking, pacing, social withdrawal, aggression, depression. These were not signs of inferior intelligence. They were symptoms of cognitive deprivation. Brains evolved for complex social systems cannot function properly in isolation or artificial environments. Oliver's upright walk, once viewed as miraculous, was likely a learned behavior reinforced by human attention. His emotional expressions, once considered uncanny, were adaptive responses to a human-dominated environment. Even his apparent preference for humans was not evidence of hybridity. It was evidence of imprinting. Oliver had imprinted on the only caregivers he ever knew, and imprinting does not fade easily. The deeper lesson of Oliver's life began to emerge, not about evolution, but about responsibility. For centuries, humans have used animals as mirrors. We dress them like us, train them to imitate us, reward them when they resemble us, and then we marvel how human they seem. Oliver was the ultimate reflection of that impulse. He became human-like not because he was half human, but because humans demanded it, consciously or not. In chasing wonder, we created confusion. In seeking entertainment, we manufactured isolation. And in our obsession with crossing boundaries, we forgot why boundaries exist in the first place. Ethicists reviewing Oliver's story in later years posed a haunting question. If an animal displays human-like intelligence, does that grant it moral consideration beyond its species?
And if so, what happens when humans deliberately cultivate that intelligence without providing the environment it requires? Oliver could not consent to becoming a mystery. He could not refuse the role assigned to him. His life became an experiment without protocols, a spectacle without safeguards, and yet he endured, not with rage, not with violence, but with quiet resilience. When Oliver died in 2012, caretakers reported that his final days were calm. He was surrounded by familiar faces. He was not alone. And perhaps that was the closest he ever came to belonging. Today, Oliver's legacy exists not in textbooks, but in policy changes. His story, along with others like it, helped push forward stricter regulations on primate ownership, entertainment use, and research ethics. Chimpanzees are no longer legally classified as pets in many countries. Their use in invasive research has been severely restricted. Sanctuaries have expanded. Awareness has grown. These changes did not come from fear of what chimpanzees might become. They came from recognition of what they already are: sentient, complex, emotionally vulnerable, capable of suffering in ways once reserved for humans alone. Oliver did not change science by redefining species. He changed it by redefining care, by forcing researchers to admit that intelligence cannot be extracted from context, that behavior cannot be separated from environment, that identity is not written solely in genes, but sculpted by experience. In the end, Oliver was not a miracle because he walked upright. He was a miracle because he survived a world that never knew what to do with him. He stood at the edge of two worlds and belonged fully to neither. And that may be the most human story of all.